again. It's a rich thing. start again. It's a rich thing.
The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
Democracy simply means the bludgeoning of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy substitutes selection by the incompetent many for appointment by the corrupt few.
Democracy is the most expensive and nefarious government ever heard of on Earth.
Democracy is when the people control the government.
Under a democratic or popular government, above all, the citizen should say each day of his life from the bottom of his heart, I prefer dangerous liberty to peaceful servitude.
The fabric of democracy is always fragile everywhere because it depends on the will of the citizens to defend it. And when they become scared, when it becomes dangerous for them to protect, it can go very quickly.
Hiding from my future, never knew what I was meant for. Scared to take a step, cause if I left, then it would mean war. If I go to battle, will I make it back? And if I never do, will I wish I had? Cause now there's something calling me to jump into the deep end. Feels like my whole life until the second I've been dreaming. If I ask, would you come and fight with me? It's not just a moment, it's a destiny. We could be the warriors. They don't know who they're messing with. They don't know we were born for this. We could be the warriors. They don't know who they're messing with. So let them know who they're messing with. No one ever thought that we could build ourselves an army. Got each other's back until we finished what we started. Kicking down the doors till the kingdom falls.
Democracy means mobilizing the entire physical, economic, and spiritual resources of all the people in the service of the common good. So, a Democrat must be utterly selfless. I value individual freedom, but man is essentially a social being who has learned to adjust individualism to the requirements of social progress. Unrestricted individualism is the law of the beast of the jungle, whereas democracy, disciplined and enlightened, is the finest thing in the world. The spirit of democracy requires a change of heart, the inculcation of that spirit of brotherhood, and the commitment to nonviolence.
Democracy is much broader than a method of government. It is a way of life based on the idea that no man or set of men is wise enough or good enough to rule others without their consent. The democratic idea of freedom is not the right of each individual to do as he pleases, even if he does not interfere with the same freedom on the part of others. Rather, the basic freedom is that of freedom of mind and of whatever freedom of action and experience are necessary to produce that freedom of mind.
When we entered into treaties with our brothers the whites, their whole cry was more land. And now, the same again. By what authority, by what law, on what pretense does my brother make this exorbitant demand of nearly all the lands we hold? You talk of the law of nature and the law of nations, and they are both against you. Indeed, much has been advanced on what you term the lack of civilization among the Indians, and many proposals have been made for us to adopt your laws, your religion, your manners, and your customs. But we confess that we should be better pleased to behold the good effect of these doctrines on your own practices, rather than to hear you talk about how good they will be for us. The great God of nature has placed us in different situations. It is true that he has endowed you with many superior advantages, but he has not created us to be your slaves.
Without dignity, there is no liberty. Without justice, there is no dignity. And without independence, there are no free men.
Our resistance will be long and painful, but whatever the sacrifices, however long the struggle, we shall fight to the end until Vietnam is fully independent and reunified. Nothing is more precious than independence and liberty.
The victory of democracy in South Africa is the common achievement of all humanity.
All men recognize the right of revolution, the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are unendurable. I think we should be men first and subjects afterward. If the machine of government ever requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. I must not lend myself to the wrong I condemn. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, then the true place for a just man is prison. Cast your whole vote, not just a piece of paper.
Protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy. It is absolutely essential to it.
It is folly to talk of a just government and a pure religion in a nation where the state and the church alike sustained an aristocracy of wealth and ease, while those who do the hard work of the world have no share in the blessings and riches that their continued two labors have made possible for others to enjoy.
If America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too will go to hell.
Some people argue that certain people are not ripe for freedom. If one accepts this assumption, freedom will never be achieved. One cannot arrive at the maturity for freedom without having already acquired that freedom. One must be free to learn how to make use of one's powers. The first attempts will surely be brutal and will lead to a state of affairs more painful and dangerous than the former condition, under the dominance, but also the protection of external authority. However, one can achieve reason only through one's own experiences, and one must be free to be able to have them. God created humans to be free.
Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide.
Now, suppose you are an idiot, and suppose you are a member of Congress. But I repeat myself.
Under democracy, one party always devotes its chief energies to trying to prove that the other party is unfit to rule. Both commonly succeed, and both are right.
Of course, the people don't want war. Why should some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, It is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy, or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist regime. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country.
There is enormous hypocrisy in the pious veneration of the Constitution and rule of law. The Constitution, like the Bible, is infinitely flexible and is used to serve the political needs of the moment. When the country was in economic crisis and turmoil in the 30s, and capitalism needed to be saved from the anger of the poor and hungry and unemployed, the Supreme Court was willing to stretch to infinity the constitutional rights of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. It decided that the national government, desperate to regulate farm production, could tell a family farmer what to grow on his tiny piece of land. When the Constitution gets in the way of war, it's ignored. When the Supreme Court was faced during Vietnam with a suit by soldiers refusing to go, claiming that there had been no declaration of war, which the Constitution required, the soldiers could not get 4 Supreme Court justices to agree to even hear the case. When during World War I, Congress ignored the First Amendment's right to free speech by passing legislation to prohibit criticism of the war, the imprisonment of dissenters under this law was upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court. It would be naive to depend on the Supreme Court to defend the rights of poor people, people of color, women, dissenters of all kinds. Those rights only come alive when the citizens organize, demonstrate, protest, boycott, rebel, and violate the law in order to uphold justice.
I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice.
The history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions to her august claims have been born of struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Progress is needed, and power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never did, and it never will. I have observed this in my experience of slavery, that whenever my condition was improved, rather than increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free and set me to thinking of ways to gain that freedom. To make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision and, as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that feeling only when he has ceased to be a man.
This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would do that men should do unto me, I should do even so unto them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavored to act on that instruction. I believe to have interfered as I have done on behalf of God's despised poor was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust laws, then let it be done.
Democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever, through compromise and fear.
I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land.
I tire so of hearing people say, "Let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day." I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread.
Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need.
I live here too. I want freedom, just as you.
It has come to the president's attention that executive branch agencies have spent millions of taxpayer dollars to date training government workers to believe divisive, anti-American propaganda. For example, employees have been required to attend trainings where they are told that virtually all white people contribute to racism, or where they are required to say that they benefit from racism. These types of trainings not only run counter to the fundamental beliefs for which our nation has stood since its inception, but they also engender division and resentment within the federal workforce. We can be proud that as an employer, the federal government has employees of all races, ethnicities, and religions. However, we cannot accept our employees receiving training that seeks to undercut our core values as Americans and drive division within our workforce. The president has directed me to ensure that federal agencies cease and desist from using taxpayer dollars to fund these divisive, un-American propaganda training sessions. All agencies are directed to begin to identify all contracts or other agency spending related to any training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either one, that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. In addition, all agencies should begin to identify all available avenues within the law to cancel any such contracts and or to divert federal dollars away from these un-American propaganda training sessions. The president has a proven track record of standing for those whose voice has long been ignored and who have failed to benefit from all our country has to offer. And he intends to continue to support all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or creed. The divisive, false, and demeaning propaganda of the critical race theory movement is contrary to all we stand for as Americans.
Millions of people have fought thousands of battles to enlarge my freedom. This is why I remain an optimist, though I am a realist about the barriers before us. Despite its virtues and attributes, America is deeply racist, and its democracy is flawed, both economically and socially. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are rooted deeply in the structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced.
We proclaim that Black liberation is our liberation also. The time has come to change the divisive narrative. American society, white supremacy, the media have long pitted the Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Black communities against each other, using the model minority myth to drive a wedge between us. We owe a great debt of gratitude for the struggles of Black activists, Black churches, Black ministers, and the Black community. Their sacrifices have benefited all Americans, including Asian Americans. Our communities belong to each other.
It is from a place of deep love and power that we declare Indigenous solidarity and action in support of Black liberation and Black power. With strong hearts, minds, and actions, we stand and uplift our love for and defense of Black lives. The Indigenous Environmental Network stands with Black lives. We kneel with Black lives. We cry with Black lives, and we fight for Black lives. We dedicate ourselves to the liberation of Black people. We believe in protecting and expanding investment in community-led health and safety strategies, not funding racist police forces. We pledge to work alongside our Black relatives to collapse capitalist, patriarchal, colonial systems. In this moment, we lift up and center Black voices and the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, this does not mean that police brutality inflicted upon Native communities is any less crucial to address. It does not mean that our struggles are any less important. In fact, standing in solidarity and supporting Black Lives Matter addresses the root causes of that brutality: systemic racism and white supremacy. Dismantling these systems is the work we need to do together. America is built upon genocide of Indigenous peoples and the enslavement and labor of Africans. Systems of racism, sexism, and the concentration of wealth and power among the few have been the foundation of a deeply unjust society. We have been pitted against one another to serve racist and divisive interests. We reject this false division and embrace the collective struggle.
The 4th of July still doesn't mean that much. We're still second-class citizens. I don't think it's hopeless. Somebody once said that pessimism is a tool of white oppression, and I think that's true. I think in many ways we're still slaves to the notion that it will never get better. But I think that there is hope. And I think it is important that we celebrate Black joy and Black life, and we remember that change is possible, change is probable, and that there is hope.
Legend has it we could be legends, etched in the stone, forever on thrones. History's made in the moments. Heroes collide, it's all on the line with our backs against the wall. We came to fight. We came to take what was meant to be ours. There's no place to hide.
If voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it.
In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors were. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, then we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
The rights of men stem exclusively from the fact that they are sentient beings, capable of acquiring moral ideas and of reasoning upon them. Since women have the same qualities, they necessarily also have the same rights. Either no member of the human race has any true rights, or else they all have the same ones. And anyone who votes against the rights of another, whatever his religion, color, or sex, automatically forfeits his own.
Virtue can only flourish among equals. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. Women ought to have representation, instead of being arbitrarily governed without any direct share allowed them in the deliberations of government.
Many, many years ago, your forefathers decided that they must have representation for taxation. When they felt they couldn't wait any longer, when they laid out all the arguments and their arguments were disregarded, when every other means had failed, they began the Tea Party at Boston and went on until they won the independence of the United States of America. You have two hungry babies wanting to be fed. One baby is patient and waits until its mother is ready to feed it. The other baby is impatient and cries, screams and kicks until it is fed. We know perfectly well which baby is attended to first. That is the whole history of politics. You have to make more noise than anybody else. You have to make yourself more obtrusive than anybody else. You have to fill the papers more than anybody else. You have to be there all the time and see that they do not snow you under. In our struggle for women to get the vote, people have suffered. But you cannot make omelets without breaking eggs. You cannot fight this kind of war without damage to something. The great thing is to see that no more damage is done than is absolutely necessary. That is
Feminism is a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians.
People call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat or a prostitute.
The Voting Rights Act requires states to beseech the federal government for permission to implement laws that they would otherwise have the right to enact and execute on their own. And despite the tradition of equal sovereignty, the act applies to only 9 states. Largely because of the Voting Rights Act, voter turnout and registration rates in covered jurisdictions now approach parity. Blatant discriminatory evasions of federal decrees are rare. And minority candidates hold office at unprecedented levels. Section 4's formula is unconstitutional in light of current conditions.
throwing out the Voting Rights Act, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet.
I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Half the American people never read a newspaper. Half never vote for president. The same half.
My dear friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union.
Who is the sovereign here? To what ruler should I report the words of my lord, King Creon, master of Thebes?
Not a good way to start, stranger. Looking for one master in Athens. Our city is free, not governed by a single man. The people rule her by turns, in succession, year by year, so our poor have the same power as the rich.
You must be joking. My city, Thebes, is ruled by one man, not by a mob. No one in Thebes plays politics with the crowd, offering them this, then that, whatever sounds good at the time, but always with an eye to private profit, working backroom deals that milk the city dry, hiding old corruption in new scams, never facing justice. Well, justice that sticks. Tell me, if the people can't distinguish true from false, how can they keep the city straight on course? Knowledge comes from experience, not in a flash. Even if a peasant weren't a fool, with all the work he has to do, how could he find the time or inclination to think about the common good? For those in the know, the upper classes, it's a curse when someone riles up the mob with fancy talk and they fall for it. So much for your democracy.
There is nothing worse for a city than a single ruler. When someone governs alone, he takes himself for the law, and then there's no protection for the common good. But when the law is written to protect us all, then the poor have the same rights as the rich. If a wealthy citizen does wrong, anyone can appeal to the law and prevail with justice on his side. That is liberty. But a tyrant is above the law. Whomever he cannot buy, he destroys, whatever it takes to preserve his power. For everyone else, why work for the health of a city if you don't share in its prosperity or in its government?
A rhetorician is to politics what a pastry chef is to medicine. Both flatter the consumer, but neither delivers what he promises, a just city or a healthy body. Politicians say what they think people want to hear, and they do it to gain political power. This has no more to do with improving the health of the state than offering cake to a sick man instead of the medicine that will cure his disease.
Consider, when the court rises, each of you will go home, not wondering whether it will be someone friendly or someone unfriendly you will meet on the way, or a big shot or a nobody or anything like that. Now, why? Because each citizen trusts our democratic constitution and knows that no one will rob him or insult him or do violence against him with impunity. Now, what gives you such confidence? and such power and control over life in the city? It is not because you are armed and mobilized, or that you are physically the strongest. No, you are powerful through the laws. If you are attacked, the laws will not come to your aid. They are just words, letters inscribed in stone. You are powerful through the laws, and the laws are powerful through you. And you must stand up for them in the same way you would stand up for yourself if attacked. You must treat an attack on the law as an attack on you and on every one of us.
Freedom. I don't wanna work every day just to pay bills and die. I need freedom. Feeling like a caged bird. I wanna spread my wings and fly. That freedom. Told my girl pack the bags, man. We about to catch a cab, and we need freedom. Oh man, we could all use a little bit of freedom. Alarm going off. Yeah, it's time to wake up.
This country has just not dealt with class as an anti-discrimination category in any robust way. So either we have to get class included among, the constitutional and the statutory protections we have against state and employer-based discrimination. Don't hold your breath.
Like I can't do math, man. Hop in my whip and it's falling apart. Baby mama tripping, it's hard when we talk. I feel like a whip if I don't follow my heart. I need a spaceship and dip and fly.
So far as it is instituted for the security of property, civil government is in reality for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none.
The whole dream of democracy is to raise the proletarian to the level of stupidity attained by the bourgeois.
It is obvious that we cannot speak a pure democracy as long as different classes exist. We can only speak of class democracy. Pure democracy is the mendacious lie of a liberal who wants to fool the workers. It really means bourgeois democracy, which was a great historical advance in comparison with feudalism. But under capitalism, it is bound to remain restricted, truncated, false, and hypocritical, a paradise for the rich and a snare and deception for the exploited, for the poor. Just consider how the most democratic bourgeoisie in America deal with workers on strike.
Democracy is the canal through which Bolshevism lets its poisons flow into the separate countries and lets them work long enough for these infections to cripple intelligence and resistance.
On a whole, with scandalous exceptions, democracy has given the ordinary worker more dignity than he ever had.
On a different type of diet now. Before I eat, I check my bank account. I'd like to take her out to dinner, but I had to hang her out to dry. My line got suspended. Not intended to spend it before I get it. But in Los Angeles, the price of gas is so expensive. Although it's check to check, and I can't pay my rent. Swear to God, I'm pouring up on my last cigarette, like I'm too broke to die, too broke to kick it. I'm too broke to die, but I can't afford to stay alive. And I'm too broke to die, too broke to kick it.
The country is headed towards a single and splendid government of an aristocracy, founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. And if this tendency continues, it will be the end of freedom and democracy. I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to trial and bid defiance to the laws of our country.
The great enemy of freedom is the alignment of political power with wealth. This alignment destroys the commonwealth, that is, the natural wealth of localities and the local economies of household, neighborhood, and community, and so destroys democracy, of which the commonwealth is the foundation.
Our democracy has been hijacked by a corporate government, moving on all fronts to advance narrow profit motives at the expense of civil liberties. Large corporate lobbies and their law firms have produced a powerful juggernaut, and they flood our public elections with cash and use their media conglomerates to exclude, divert, and propagandize. And they brandish their willingness to close factories here and open them abroad if workers do not bend to their wishes. And by their controlling Congress, they've gained a wide array of privileges and immunities, tax escapes, enormous corporate welfare subsidies, federal giveaways, and bailouts. Now, the democracy gap that has resulted spells a deep sense of powerlessness by people who drop out, do not vote, or listlessly vote for the least worst every 4 years and then wonder why after another cycle the least worst just got worse. We need a deep democracy embraced by its citizens, democratic tools that bring out the best of people, and humane ways to resolve our society's deficiencies and injustices. As Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis declared 50 years ago, we can have a democratic society, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. We cannot have both.
Because speech is an essential mechanism of democracy, it is the means to hold officials accountable to the people. Political speech must prevail against laws that would suppress it, by design or inadvertence. The court has recognized that the First Amendment applies to corporations. All speakers, including individuals and the media, use money amassed from the economic marketplace to fund their speech, and the First Amendment protects the resulting speech. Differential treatment of media corporations and other corporations cannot be squared with the First Amendment. This court now concludes that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption.
In the context of election to public office, the distinction between corporate and human speakers is significant. Although they make enormous contributions to our society, corporations are not actually members of it. They cannot vote or run for office. What's more, they may be managed and controlled by non-residents. Their interests may conflict in fundamental respects with the interests of eligible voters. The financial resources, legal structure, and instrumental orientation of corporations raise legitimate concerns about their role in the electoral process. Our lawmakers have a compelling constitutional basis, if not also a democratic duty, to take measures designed to guard against the potentially deleterious effects of corporate spending in local and national races.
I think the notion that we have all the democracy that money can buy strays so far from what our democracy is supposed to be.
Now, there's a notion gaining credence that the free market breaks down national barriers, and that corporate globalization's ultimate destination is a hippie paradise where the heart is the only passport and we all live together inside a John Lennon song. This is a canard. What the free market breaks down is not national sovereignty, but democracy. As the disparity between the rich and poor grows, the hidden fist has its work cut out for it. Multinational corporations on the prowl for sweetheart deals that yield enormous profits cannot push through those projects and administer those deals without the active connivance of local state machinery. The police, the courts, sometimes even the army. Today, corporate globalization needs an international confederation of loyal, corrupt, authoritarian governments. It needs a press that pretends to be free. It needs courts that pretend to dispense justice. It needs nuclear bombs, sterner immigration laws, and watchful coastal patrols to make sure that it's only money, goods, patents, and services that are globalized, not the free movement of people, not a respect for human rights, not international treaties on racial discrimination, or chemical and nuclear weapons, or climate change, or God forbid, justice.
6 minutes and about 20 seconds. In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us, 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone, in the Douglas community was forever altered. Everyone who was there understands. Everyone who has been touched by the cold grip of gun violence understands.
You kept cutting the cord, and I started to fade into your gray. See, I finally opened up my eyes, and I saw me coming back to life. That I'd be better without you inside. It's time to be someone I want to recognize. The future starts right now. I made a reservation, but you never came, so I'm checking out. The fire you stole away, I know one day we'll come back around. The future is now. The future is now.
It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance along with everybody else has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not, in its whole system of reality, evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another only on the basis of the color of their skin begins there and accelerates. Accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So the present, you discover you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you've been through a certain kind of mill. The most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disasters, the policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details. 24 hours of every day which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It is by that time you've begun to see it happening to your daughter, or your son, or your niece, or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you escape the trap. But what is worse than that is nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do will save your son or daughter from meeting the same disaster, and not impossibly the same end. I'm stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, I picked the cotton, and I brung it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip. For nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars? The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom, or my right to live there, or my citizenship, how is that conceivably a question now? It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. Until that moment comes, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it is a very grave moment for the West.
Why is it that countries which we call strong are so powerful in creating wars but are so weak in bringing peace? Why is it that giving guns is so easy but giving books is so hard? Why is it? Why is it that making takes is so easy but building schools is so hard?
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency, but no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil. And that I refuse to believe. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, the remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any plans presented in line with these figures here today because these numbers are too uncomfortable, and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming, whether you like it or not. My message is that we'll be watching you.
every single person up here today, all these people should be home, grieving. But instead, we are up here standing together because if all our government and president can do is send thoughts and prayers, then it's time for the victims to be the change we need to see. Since the time of the founding fathers and since they added the Second Amendment to the Constitution, our guns have developed at a rate that leaves me dizzy. Our guns have changed, but our laws have not. We certainly do not understand why it should be harder to make plans with friends on weekends than to buy an automatic or semi-automatic weapon. In Florida, to buy a gun, you do not need a permit. You do not need a gun license, and once you buy it, you do not need to register it. You do not need a permit to carry a concealed rifle or shotgun. You can buy as many guns as you want at one time. Instead of worrying about our AP Government Chapter 16 test, we have to be studying our notes to make sure our arguments based on politics and political history are watertight. I found out today there's a website, shootingtracker.com. Nothing in the title suggests that it is exclusively tracing the USA shootings, and yet, does it need to address that? Because Australia had one mass shooting in 1999 in Port Arthur, and after the massacre, introduced gun safety. And it hasn't had one since. Japan has never had a mass shooting. Canada has had 3, and the UK had 1, and they both introduced gun control. And yet here we are, with websites dedicated to reporting these tragedies so that they can be formulated into statistics for your convenience. When we've had our say with the government, and maybe the adults have gotten used to saying it is what it is, but if there's anything us students have learned, it's that if you don't study, you will fail. And in this case, if you actively do nothing, people continually end up dead. So it's time to start doing something.
Democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
There's something pitiable about a people that constantly bemoans its political leaders. If they've let us down, it's only because we've allowed them to.
If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing.
The heart of the charges against democracy lies in the habit it has of making itself generally disagreeable by asking the powers that be at the most inconvenient moment whether they are the powers that ought to be.
Our hopes as to the future condition of the human species come down to 3 things: the destruction of inequality between different nations, the progress of equality in one and the same nation, and the real improvement of human beings.
Good evening, everybody. As you've seen by now, this isn't a normal convention. It's not a normal time.
So tonight, I want to talk as plainly as I can about the stakes in this election. Because what we do these next 76 days will echo throughout generations to come.
I'm in Philadelphia, where our Constitution was drafted and signed. It wasn't a perfect document. It allowed for the inhumanity of slavery and failed to guarantee women and even men who didn't own property the right to participate in the political process.
But embedded in this document was a North Star that would guide future generations, a system of representative government, a democracy, through which we could better realize our highest ideals.
Through civil war and bitter struggles, we improved this Constitution to include the voices of those who'd once been left out. And gradually we made this country more just, more equal, and more free.
The one constitutional office elected by all of the people is the presidency. So at a minimum, we should expect a president to feel a sense of responsibility for the safety and welfare of all 330 million of us, regardless of what we look like, how we worship, who we love, how much money we have, or who we voted for.
But we should also expect a president to be the custodian of this democracy. We should expect that regardless of ego, ambition, or political beliefs, the president will preserve, protect, and defend the freedoms and ideals that so many Americans marched for and went to jail for, fought for, and died for.
I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing that all cannot have on equal terms.
Gotta change around here. Gotta change around here. Can't go on this way. Things gonna change around here. Say it loud, say it clear. Things gonna change around here. Fingers on the trigger around here. Fingers on the trigger around here. Bullets flying, mothers crying. We gotta change around here. Get it straight, make sure that you hear. Things gonna change around here. What good is freedom if we haven't learned to be free? What good is freedom if we haven't learned to be free? Day after day, year after year, we're gonna change around here. X is the letter, blue is the color, 1 is the number, now is the time. Give a change around here. Got change around here. Say it loud and say it clear. We got change around here. Change around here. Got change around here. Lord, oh Lord. Got change around here. Say it loud, say it clear. We gotta change around here.
All right, well, thank you everybody who stuck around for our post-show panel, and thank you so much to all the actors and the dramaturgs and the designers and everybody who helped put this show together. This was my first experience directing Zoom theater, and it was a blast. I'm Lindsay Mantone. I directed this piece, and I'm happy to introduce our panelists, or maybe have you all introduce yourselves, actually. Elsa, do you want to go first?
Yes, I'm fresh from the land of Frozen. This is actually my daughter's screen name that always shows up when on this computer. My name is Pat Cottrell. I'm the chair of the political science department, and I just want to say thank you to you, Lindsay, and thank you to the wonderful actors who put this performance on. My family loved it, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Nick?
Hey everybody, Nick Bucola here, also from the Department of Political Science overrepresented. I'm really happy to be here. I'm so grateful to everyone who put in work on this show. Really incredible show. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Thanks, Nick. And Pedro.
Hey, hello everyone. I'm Pedro Graterol. I am a senior political science and music double major, and I serve as executive director for the political science work study team.
Excellent. I'm so grateful that the three of you are joining us tonight. When we were in the Zoom room right before we went to the live stream, Pat was asking about asking questions to the actors. If you have any, should we start with that, Pat?
Yes, absolutely. I was renaming myself on the screen. So my question to the actors is, which quote from your, I'm going to give you two questions and choose to answer either one, because I was actively thinking about this. And I have a question for you, the same question for you actually, Lindsay, as well, if you wouldn't mind. Which quote that you performed was most meaningful to you and why? And then second question, and this is for you, Lindsay, as well, is what's the before and after picture look like for you in terms of your perceptions of democracy prior to being cast in Democratically Speaking? And Lindsay, I know you adapted the screenplay for this as well. And so, in this political moment, what were some of the challenges and insights that you gained from the process? And thanks, everybody.
Those are a lot of questions, man. I love it. Let's take the first one first. So actors, anyone who is interested, feel free to turn on your camera and join us and say what line was most meaningful to you and why. I so have a guess as to what Lucy will say. Go ahead, Lucy.
Okay, so first of all, the most meaningful to me, because it was funny, was the whole anti-feminist one, where I was like, it teaches women to be witches and lesbians and kill their husbands. Just like, it's so fun. Like, I did feminism do that to me? Maybe. You guys, maybe. But like one that I loved like saying was the Ralph Nader monologue, because that was another one that like hugely resonated with me, because we do need a democracy that people feel involved in. Like that's why I made the vote and stay vigilant sign, because just voting, that's just a tiny bit of the process of engaging in democracy. You need to actually do actions that give you things to vote on. give you people that you want to vote for, basically. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. Mara?
My favorite piece that I get to perform in the show is definitely the Emma Gonzalez one about gun control. And I think this one, it's so very real for so many people, just everyone living in the United States. It's so familiar hearing about mass shootings as if it's something that's normal or something that's part of living in the United States. And especially for young people, everyone who grew up and who grew up in this last decade or so, doing these drills. By the time you're in first grade, kindergarten even, you are doing these drills. That these things happen even when you do not understand exactly what they are or why people do it or why it's still happening. And so I think that it's a really important monologue that to do, and I'm really glad it's included in the show, because it's a very real issue, and I think one that we're all too familiar with. Yeah.
I mean, when my kids were in kindergarten, they were doing active shooter drills. It's very strange. Pat, my answer to your question, what line in this piece stands out the most to me is, this is not a normal time. And this comes from the Barack Obama convention speech from August. And I watched the conventions, and when I heard that line, that was when I thought, oh, I have to direct Democratically Speaking this fall. I had been thinking of doing something else, but I had directed this last election cycle, and it felt really important to do it again this time. I don't remember all the other questions, but let's get Nick and Pedro in on this. Do you all have questions for the cast, or me, or each other, or comments?
Pedro, you want to jump in? You want me to jump in? Maybe just yeah. Do you want?
What did you say?
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go?
You should go first.
So polite.
Age before, yeah. So I guess just maybe it's a nice segue from what Lindsay just asked, and this is for everybody, who participated in the show and thought about all this. I mean, this is if there ever was a show for a political theorist, this was it. So thank you all for, making political theory come to life. But I guess just to put the last line that Lindsay highlighted, and maybe in tension with one of the other lines in the play, the sort of this is not a normal time. I wonder, is that true? I get it, and I understand why President Obama said it, but doesn't much of what we heard in the rest of the play that it is normal, right? That people are going to be marginalized, and there's going to be people trying to undermine your freedom and your ability to participate. Through and through, all those, the story going way back, right? This is part of what we're hearing. So, in some sense, where it's not normal that we have people doing and saying things that are in much more obvious ways than seems, to be the ordinary. But those things have been going on, forever. And certainly, if we just want to talk about American history, this is, this story goes back to the very beginning. So I just wonder about those two things. And just last point on this is the line that comes to mind. I can't remember which, who said it, but the sort of, I'm going to stop there. Actually, I'm just going to leave. That's enough to chew on. I'll go to the other thing later.
And kind of related of what Nick was saying, when looking at all of the parts of the monologues in aggregate, I came to the realization that defining democracy is very difficult. In a way, we define democracy with the institutional framework of our time, but like Nick was just saying, a lot of these questions go and will continue happening for a long time. So after watching all of these monologues, my main takeaway is that democracy is not so much the institutional frameworks or the practice of voting or watching the news or interacting, but it's this human spirit that goes back to the primordial age of humanity of caring about each other and trying to build a better community. And seeing throughout history this constant inspiration is quite inspiring and gives a sense of optimism in the entire bleakness of the modern discourse.
Thank you. I have Pat's other question, which I think is a really interesting one for the actors, and then I can weigh in after. What did you learn about democracy by going through this production? So like kind of a before and after, or what's one of your big takeaways about democracy, having studied these lines and performed them and listened to your castmates do the same? Are there any actors who want to jump in there? Hi, Calder.
I think what stuck out to me, what I was thinking when you asked that question, Pat, was kind of what Nick was saying. Like, what I hear a lot these days is everyone's got these fresh takes about how, democracy has fallacies and like there's all this stuff that's wrong with it. And it's just interesting to me hearing all these historical politicians and great thinkers who said this all along. Like, there are fallacies, there are things that will inevitably go wrong. And like, these aren't fresh takes. This is just what we've known about democracy.
I think one of the things that really stands out to me is how democracy and capitalism are related. This is one of the things that the first time I directed this, and then it hit home anew the second time. There's this quote about like, democracy is to protect the people who own land from the people who don't. And then, Citizens United and just questions of what it means to flood elections with money and what it means to disenfranchise people through financial strategies. It's really interesting to me. Lucy.
This one I discussed with Alexandria. She helped me with the Demosthenes. It's hard to pronounce. His monologue, the one I'm prosecuting Medius, the idea of being powerful through the laws. A law doesn't make you powerful, and you're not powerful just because you're a citizen in a democratic society. You have to actively interact with the laws that are in existence, and I don't know, not like shape them to your will, but you have to, like I said in my earlier thing, you actually have to put yourself out there and go and be part of that. Participation is the essence of democracy. So really emphasizing that issue of you gotta get in there. You gotta get elbows deep if you really care about it and you want to make a change. And we need a lot of people to do that. So not just looking at it from a distance or looking at laws as something, flimsy or a wall. It's something that you have to sort of step through.
Speaking to what Lucy said here, there's one of my favorite authors. His name is Walter Beggett. He writes a book called The English Constitution, in which he outlines 3 layers of government. There's the ceremonial, so you have like kings, queens, presidents, and all of like the showmanship aspect of government. You also have the real aspect of government, that is like the policy making and the discussions in parliament or Congress. But I think that we need to talk now of a 3rd layer, that is the layer of citizen involvement. Politics and democracy goes beyond going and voting for the candidate that you want and transcends what we normally consider politics. I think there's a big argument to say that politics happens when we're talking with our neighbors and trying to solidify communities and trying to figure out solutions within ourselves. So I think that it's important to broaden our scope and our definition of what democracy is and the role that everyone should be playing, because I don't think it's reasonable to be asked all of the citizens to be super involved. That's political science. People go crazy over like watching the news all the time. But I think that if we discover that we all have different roles inside of this tradition and this spirit of ethics and care, I think we have a bright future ahead of us.
I'm so glad Pedro's here. I love this. Nick and Pat, to get you two into this, what were some of your takeaways from the show? Or you've been thinking about democracy more rigorously and for longer than those of us working on the show probably, but do you view democracy any differently now, or what stands out to you?
Well, I can riff off of your point, Lindsay, about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. one of the quotes that came to mind to me that wasn't in the production, in political theory, and Nick is much more of an expert than I am, so I defer to the man in the hat. But one of the debates, will people mobilize around and discover a common interest and be able to access the political process in a way that will affect change? And one of the quotes that connects the democracy, capitalism, and Nick's heard me say this before, like 10 years ago in one of our events for Constitution Day, was a guy called E.E. Schachtschneider. Don't try to spell it, but he has a beautiful quote, which is the heavenly chorus of the interest group process sings with an upper class accent, which I think is a wonderful quote, because even if you are able to get involved into interest group process, who is involved, and what does it take to get access to democracy in a way that the legislation and outcomes are going to follow? And I think that is one of the huge questions that we continue to face, and was a theme that was very present throughout all 7 parts of the show tonight.
I knew you bring Schneider in here, Cottrell. No, it's a very, very helpful line. I guess a couple things that occur to me. One is, and I think I'm thinking in terms of sort of paradoxes. I mean, one thing that I really appreciated about the selections is, you do have all these skeptics, right, running through the thing, right? Not just skeptics, the obvious people who are anti-democratic in their impulses, but just, people who are maybe, Twain, you get your H.L. Mencken in there, you get Thoreau in there, and these are people who, had their reservations about democracy. And I think that, to me, jumped out because, in part, I mean, this is where this thing happens in political theory so much. I just actually wrote something about this in reaction to a book I was reviewing, is that in political theory right now, and this is true in a lot of other times, if you like something, you call it democracy. And if you don't like something, you call it neoliberalism. And it's so annoying. It's so annoying because that's, we're like, we don't know what we're talking about, right? So part of what we should be doing, right, as political theorists, and certainly this goes, this is true of citizens too, is to really ask ourselves every now and then, do we know what we are talking about, right? And so, and that's where I think there's this paradox that confronts us, and that is that with all these skeptics you pulled out in the presentation, in the show, I mean, they're kind of onto something, right? Because democracy, right, depending on, again, as Pedro said, depending on how we define it, like the people, do we really trust the people, right? If it's government of the people, all sorts of these problems that are identified in the show, whether they be our economic problems, our problems with gun violence, all these other things that, sort of the line Lucy, quoted from Pat Robertson. I mean, like there are a lot of people out there who believe those things, right? And so are we going to say that those people are being undemocratic and trying to express those beliefs? I mean, that's a big conversation, right? But I think there's something, that's where I sometimes I worry, right, when democracy is the master concept, so to speak, because I just think that democracy is tricky, and depending on how we define it, it might be in tension with other things we care about. I just want to say one last thing about this, and I'll shut up. One of my favorite political theorists, Judith Shklar, has this idea where she's talking about liberalism as a philosophy that fundamentally is concerned with personal freedom, right? So all of us in the Zoom room probably care on some level about personal freedom, and we can define that in a variety of ways. But she says, democracy and a philosophy of personal freedom, they are married together, but they're married. It's a marriage of convenience, not of true love. Right. And that always sticks in my mind, right? Because that's we have to think about democracy what is democracy and how is it related to other things we care about? I'll shut up.
Thinking about what Nick was just mentioning about paradoxes, I think it's important, or like just analyzing a little bit of the last part of the panel, that to an extent we live in a time in which democracy has forgotten about itself. Democracy has been forgetting that it's the child prodigy of liberalism. And liberalism is an idea of radical thinking, of like bold ideas, of innovative approaches. There is this existing tension between what is best to address the needs of the electorate at the moment and what is best to address the needs of the political infrastructure that has existed. So that's why you have situations like the different responses to the multiple crises that the world is facing at this time. So I think it's important at least to continue to having this relationship that democracy needs to remember what it is, and that is a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And that it's not supposed to be something stagnant that needs to be protected, but rather a mechanism of innovation and political creativity that we need for the world today.
And I would point out that I think if Rachel Schley were on this panel from the history department, she would remind us all, right, that 1920s, 30s Germany, the time when it was its most liberal democracy up until that point in history, right? And like there's more freedom, more individual freedom than anyone in the country has ever had before. This is what gives rise to fascism and Nazism. And it comes out of choice and like economic things that are happening at the same time too. But yeah, go ahead.
And something that's really interesting about this actually is that I'm fascinated by the idea of fascism in its origins, or like the first run with fascism and like its resurgence now with democratic backsliding. But something that is very interesting is that democracy in itself is very messy, and that in a true democratic process, you don't have any perfections, but you have a lot of compromises and middle points. So in a moment in which you have an absolute liberal democracy, you have an absolute amount of compromises. And in that moment, certain groups are going to look for alternatives in which their views of absolutist realities are more easily obtainable. And when you have a fascist system in which there's an idea of a common national goal that needs to be achieved, those who look for perfection in ideology are going to gravitate towards those ends. And I think that's something to complement what Rachel would say if she was here. Rachel's amazing, by the way.
Pat, you had a question for Nick, yeah?
I do have a question for you, Nick. So I noted in the first performance, I think by Robert of Baldwin in the epilogue, and those of you in the audience out there who don't know, Nick has written wrote a very successful book on that's framed around this famous James Baldwin, William F. Buckley debate in Cambridge at the Cambridge Union, of which you heard an excerpt from Baldwin's speech. And Nick has been on the speaking circuit, both pre-COVID and post-COVID via Zoom. And Nick, I'm wondering, you've been all over the country, to the Deep South, to, how has your book been received, and how has Baldwin in particular been received? And how has it varied across different audiences? And what type of insights about the state of US democracy have you gleaned from these experiences?
Wow, thanks, Pat. That's a big question. It's been really interesting. I think that one of the things that's been, I guess, most noteworthy is, I got this question, I think it was actually in Texas. It was a really awkward moment, actually. I was in Texas and I was in the John Tower Institute for Politics. And that's named after Senator John Tower. And it was one of these things where I thought, at some point, should I point out that Senator Tower voted against the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act during the course of my talk? I decided not to do it because the person who invited me was is pre-tenure, and I didn't want to get her in any trouble. But yeah, so one of the things about, at that talk, it was actually it was one of the most democratically interesting talks because I was in Texas, right, deep in the heart of Texas, and there was actually like a little debate that erupted in the aftermath of the talk, among audience members, and I got to sort of just hang out and sort of moderate. But yeah, I think one of the things that I got asked by somebody at that talk was who's the audience for this book? And I think that question, of course, like you write a book, everyone's the audience. But one of the things that's been remarkable to me, and this came up in another context this last week, is I've gotten a lot of letters and emails and things, and I've also had the experience of people coming up to me after talks before the pandemic. And there's a kind of a profile of the sort of person who's contacted me or approached me. And I would say that overwhelmingly, it's kind of middle-aged to older white men who are, reporting to me that the encounter with the book and really the encounter with the story of Baldwin and Buckley has caused them to like rethink some of their previous thoughts, which is really, I think given what my own commitments are, that's really good news, because in the sense that and I give Baldwin more credit than I give myself. I am a mere vehicle. Baldwin provides this extraordinarily powerful lens, and thank you to Robert for, did justice to those lines. That was beautiful. But yeah, Baldwin gives us this incredibly powerful lens through which to view not only William F. Buckley, but all of, anyone, including ourselves. And I think one of the things that Baldwin invites us to do, and I'll ask to say this and then shut up, is that, in terms of thinking about democracy with Baldwin, which is part of what, I was doing as I worked on the book, and part of what anybody's doing when they read James Baldwin or read about James Baldwin, he's somebody who's always there to ask us to think, in slow motion, to think more deeply about these things that we claim to care about, or these things we claim to oppose. And so there's this really remarkable moment when he's sitting there in 1961 at a table with Malcolm X and this guy Laverne McCummings, who's a student sit-in protester, and Malcolm is just laying into this student protester, because Malcolm is questioning, at that point in his career, is questioning the idea of integration. He's also questioning the means of a sit-in protest, which he thought was demeaning. And the student actually did a remarkable job defending what he was doing and why it was important. And Baldwin just, he's sort of hanging back, watching them go at it for a few minutes. And then he comes into the conversation and he says something like, I think there are a lot of words flying around this table and we haven't really figured out what they mean. And not only that, but he also said, we have to keep in mind that this is not about recovering something that was lost, right? When we're talking about democracy, it's about imagining something that might be. And I think that to me is an extraordinarily powerful thing. So we can talk about freedom, democracy, all these different things. But I think Baldwin is kind of the thinker who's always there to say, yeah, let's talk about those things, but let's also talk about what we want those things to be. So that's what I'll say. I don't know how I got there from what Pat asked.
Well, I think this idea of, do we mean the same thing when we say democracy, right? It struck me listening to the show this time tonight, just how many of the early quotes are democracy is, right? They take on that sentence structure, and it's really about like an effort at defining democracy, even if it's a joke or if it's something that kind of redirects. But so many of those sentiments are diametrically opposed to each other, or just take these very different understandings of what democracy is or what democracy could be. And I think that's really interesting. If we don't even mean the same thing when we say democracy, what's happening?
And I think that at the core of the modern problem with democracy is a semiotic problem. It's a problem with the idea of meaning. We are in an era in which we cannot come in an agreement of the meanings of different things. And one of the foundational ideas of democracy is that we interact upon the elements of a similar reality. And because of multiple reasons, polarization, technology, once we don't agree what reality is, we cannot have the same conversation. And I think, although I feel always that I'm in the middle of a superhero movie when I say this fracture of reality, it's what is threatening the feasibility for political systems. Because democracy, at least as we conceive it in the US, it's something that depends on people living in the same reality and talking about it. So I thought about that tweet.
You want to jump in there at all, Pat?
I would ask Pedro just, and we talked about this before. Some of you may know that Pedro is from Venezuela, and I'm wondering, Pedro, as watching the show, from through the lens of the Venezuelan history, which has, in recent times been quite tumultuous and is struggling with the basis of political order at the moment. What's different about what different insights about democracy might we glean from this comparative perspective?
I think the biggest insight, and yes, I am from Venezuela, Something that is very interesting is we talk a lot about Chavez and Maduro and the current political ecosystem that brought about the destruction of the republic. But I think it's important to also talk about the actors that were right before them. In the day after Chavez did his first failed coup, the senator who would become president, his name was Rafael Caldera, he said a quote that always strikes with me when I'm thinking about democracy and all of these ideas. And is, you cannot expect people to fight for democracy when democracy is not making them eat. And at its core, I've said this in a lot of classes, politics is a materialistic action. We can pontificate about the nature of ideas and the nature of philosophical higher callings, but if the system of governance that we have for the electorate is not providing shelter and food and all of that first level of Maslow pyramids, then I think we are looking into trouble, because that is the moment in which people are going to look for alternatives, and normally those alternatives are not very good.
Thumbs up. Fantastic. Well, we've been at this for a minute. I feel like I don't know, maybe we should think about wrapping up. Do any of our panelists have any questions, comments you want to make sure to get in there before we wrap up?
I just want to echo what Lucy said about, the stay vigilant, because I think that this is a moment when, there's these big moments, right, in our political lives. And this is where the quote from President Obama is certainly apt, right? This is an urgent moment. But I think there's a kind of danger in a moment like this, where everyone's a lot of hopes are riding on one particular political event, right? And that political event matters a lot. However, as Lucy pointed out, that is just one moment in political time. And so if you sort of, in terms of what you care about, what your core commitments are, what you want to see realized in the world, there's no resting, right? Every day is a struggle for that thing, whether you call it democracy or some other good that is your animating purpose in your political lives. So I just want to echo what Lucy said. I think that's absolutely crucial, that vigilance is key each and every day. And thank you all so much. This was so cool.
Echoing in a similar way, the idea is that loving democracy is not something for a moment, sorry I cut out for a second, but it's something for the long run. And democracy is fundamentally built on hope. And I've said this multiple times, hope is a deliberate action. You cannot have a hope about the moment in democracy, you have a hope towards democracy. And it's a daily choice I need to have of having these conversations, of being an engaged citizen, not because you know things are gonna be better, but because of your actions, the actions that you're doing are what is gonna make sure that democracy continues standing.
Pessimism is a tool of white supremacy. This is one of the things we quoted in the show. So you have to have hope, and then you have to be vigilant, and you have to have action as well. Pat, any last anythings?
I think public service is a very, very noble calling. And I think the minute that people become too cynical to engage in public service is really scary. And I really applaud all of you who are watching, and all of you who performed, and Lindsay for putting this on, because this is an act of public service to educate us about the past, the present, and the future of democracy. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to the terrific performers and director.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to everybody who is watching at home or wherever you happen to be for tuning in. Yeah, this was a wonderful night, wonderful discussion after the show. Congratulations to all the actors. This is a weird thing, right? Because they finish the show and then there's no applause, which is hard. So this is me applauding the actors too. All right, have a good night, everybody. Take care. Vote. Vote.